Yes, thank you. For me, I prefer the student-centered approach or the learner-centered approach. Yes, because I believe that if we give the students the opportunity to explore things on their own, the retention of information is more than when we spoon feed them with the information. I believe in the Chinese saying, I hear, I forget, I see, I remember, I do, I know. So if we can give the students the opportunity to do things, maybe us as facilitators or as lecturers, we just guide them, we give them the information how they can look for. In fact, we give them the research skills of looking for information. I think in that way is better. Personally, in my classes, I prefer breaking the work into reasonable chunks and assigning the students to look at those small chunks and presenting them in class, so that at the end of the day, the students have got ownership on what they are learning. Thank you. Thanks. I'm done.
Thanks, Pumazani. Who teaches in the room?
Pardon?
I'm just asking how many of us are teachers?
Okay.
So I'd be interested in hearing what they have to say. Do most people agree with Pumzani that student-centered is important? Oh, thanks, Bungie, you're a librarian.
Now, may I come in? So I'm really
Please.
I'm just sort of thinking out aloud. So learning centered is focusing on learning processes, the science of learning, whereas student centered would be sort of approach, which of course puts student at the center, and it's much more flexible, I guess, right? But marriage of the two to be optimal. So I'm not sure about this distinction between either or. So I guess that's where I'm sitting at currently.
Ajma, please go ahead.
I'm with Fatima. I'm not sure about the question of, is it this or is it that, because it's both. And I think the problem is that we sometimes we move between these things, these extremes, as if it is those are extremes. You cannot understand what to do with those learning needs that you hear from your students. You don't know what to do with that if you actually don't understand learning. So sometimes you focus, perhaps in your teaching, you focus on what are the learning, what are the needs of my students, who are they, how can I then best facilitate the learning, and don't know how to best facilitate the learning or mediate the learning if you don't understand how learning happens, which is, I guess maybe that's what they're saying here in terms of learning centered. I'm not sure if that's what is meant.
Najma. I'm also interested in whether learner-centered is just another way of saying student-centered, or
yeah.
I think that's probably it. Jeanette.
Yes, hi. What I'm thinking is, can one be student-centered without being learning-centered. You almost see that to be student-centered, you need to be focusing on the learning. So I would see that there needs to be a blend of the two, because for you to be student-centered, like was mentioned before, you need to understand what approaches to learning, and the two for me go hand in hand. And for us who teach in the education campus, when we have very, very large classes, I know, there are times when people might possibly slip into being very, I suppose, teacher-centered, because you have a large lecture room with over 400 students. And how do you then try to get to know your students, and how do you tailor your teaching? But I think for me, student-centered learning, learning-centered is so important. It's important to get students to reflect and get their feedback as well. And the whole notion of collaborating is so important, so that we almost start to look at that humanism that was mentioned yesterday. So if you're thinking, so I see a connection between student-centered, learning-centered, and even bringing in that bit of humanism as well, because to really make your teaching effective, and to think of what students need, and yeah, to help them to learn meaningfully. So that's what I'd say for now.
Also see them as very closely connected.
Yeah, and it's perhaps not helpful to make to kind of view it in a very kind of almost like a binary view of, you know, student-centered versus learning and learner-centered. Perhaps there are other questions we should be asking. Yeah.
I also have recently been reading a lot of, I'm looking for activities which help people empathize. And yeah, just the idea of connecting with people as humans before you design for them is critical. And I'm not sure whether you'd call that student-centered or learning-centered.
Perhaps if we agree, and we seem to be agreeing that the distinction is not that helpful, that they're both the trio. But I do think student-centered and learner-centered is perhaps one, and then the learning-centered. So it's perhaps not helpful to think of it as a binary, but to think of how they kind of entangled, how they are interconnected, and depending on the context, sometimes you have to go, you have to kind of go between the two, you know. If a student's need is XYZ, then you go to kind of interrogating the learning. So what would be the best way for students to learn this thing, whatever the need is, you know, and whether the need is for care or for to humanize the experience or whatever it is. So you vacillate kind of between the two all the time. So I still struggle a little bit with separating it.
I think for me as well, if we think of learning, we have learning within a tutorial session, we have a face-to-face learning online, and we have the large lecture room sort of engagement. So which one would lend itself to more student-centered or learning-centered approaches? And I would imagine in a tutorial where you have fewer students, then you have a greater chance to get to know your students and tailor what you're teaching and how you engage with them. So I guess there might be I don't know, when the question was put together, if there was a thinking as to where the modalities of the learning and which one is best suited for which modality, I think all of that comes into question when you think of student-centered or learning-centered. But I do agree that we can't think of them in binaries because it's quite difficult to see them as separate.
Yeah. Adriano.
Senior Eddie,
Your thoughts.
oh, we scared Eddie away.
Oh, sorry.
I-
Sorry.
Can I? Sorry.
Okay, sorry. May we share these questions so that maybe we talk or at least we are seeing the questions.
Okay.
The
Well,
Oh, what were the questions?
So I wrote them down quickly. So the first question we've answered, given your context, which appeals to you most, student-centered or learner-centered? And then the next question is, what enables or challenges your approach? We'll type it in the chat.
so if I could just sort of come in there in terms of student-centered and learning-centered approaches with regards to assessment. So a student-centered approach would sort of allow for more various forms of assessments, right? Not necessarily your formal, your standard formal approach. Is that distinction correct? And that might impact on the modality that you would lean more towards. I don't know. I'm really asking, the others who know more about assessment processes with regards to student-centered and then learning-centered.
I'm not really sure about that, Fatima. Pumazani, you have a thought?
Yes, maybe what enables me to be able to use the approach that I am using. Yeah, my classes are not as big as the ones that you are talking about. So what I normally do, I give my students very clear instructions. If they are the ones who are supposed to be presenting on a particular topic, I give them very clear instructions and also assist them in coming up with the presentations that they are going to use to share with the rest of the class. Yes, but the challenge, some students may not be cooperating, like